There is a room in the basement of the Ohio History Center in Columbus that holds, among other things, pieces of copper recovered from Hopewell burial mounds in Ross County. The copper is raw, unworked, extracted from deposits on the shores of Lake Superior, and carried more than 500 miles south before being placed in the earth around 200 CE. It has been sitting in that room for decades. The archaeological record it belongs to is public. The DNA study that confirmed who carried it is published. The question worth asking is not who built the mounds, it is why the answer took this long. I found the Cyrus Thomas report while looking for something else. I was trying to trace a pattern in federal survey records from the 1840s, specifically why so many archaeological and land surveys were conducted in territories within years of the relevant populations being removed from them. Thomas's report wasn't what I was searching for, but the deeper I went into the survey literature, the harder it became to ignore what his 730 pages contained. A conclusive answer to a question that educated Americans had been treating as a mystery for over half a century. In 1894, Thomas, a researcher employed by the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, published the results of 12 years of fieldwork across mound sites in the eastern United States. He had examined thousands of structures, analyzed burial patterns, compared ceramic sequences, and consulted the oral traditions of Native American nations whose territories encompassed the sites. His conclusion was unambiguous. The mounds had been built by the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans, not a vanished race, not a lost civilization from across the ocean, the people whose descendants were still there. Thomas was not discovering something new. He was correcting something that should never have required correction. The idea that the mounds had been built by someone other than Native Americans had taken hold in the late 18th century and hardened into received wisdom through the first half of the 19th. Caleb Atwater, an Ohio postmaster and amateur antiquarian, published a survey of American earthworks in 1820 and concluded the builders were a separate and superior people, now vanished. Josiah Priest's 1833 popular history, American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, argued the builders had been Israelites, Danes, or a lost white civilization erased by the ancestors of the Native Americans then living on that land. The book sold 22,000 copies in 18 months. The most institutionally consequential version came in 1848, when Ephraim Squire, a journalist and diplomat, and Edwin Davis, a physician, published Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the first book ever released by the newly founded Smithsonian Institution. Their fieldwork was 3 years of genuine survey across Ohio. Their measurements were precise. Their documentation was extensive. They mapped over 200 sites. Their measurements were careful. Their interpretation was not. Squire and Davis concluded the builders were an extinct race, entirely separate from and superior to the Native Americans still living on and near those mounds. The Smithsonian's imprimatur gave this conclusion a scientific authority it had previously lacked, but the authority rested on a foundation that anyone willing to look could see was political. The United States government had been actively removing indigenous nations from their eastern territories for decades. The Indian Removal Act had passed in 1830. The Cherokee were force-marched west on the Trail of Tears beginning in 1838. The same decade Squire and Davis were conducting their fieldwork. If the mounds had been constructed by a vanished and unrelated civilization, the living Native Americans held no ancestral claim to the landscape. The denial was not a scientific error. It was a scientific instrument of dispossession. What Squire, Davis, and Atwater chose not to see was already in plain view. Cahokia occupied 6 square miles of the American bottom floodplain in present-day southwestern Illinois. At its peak, between roughly 1050 and 1100 CE, the city held a population approaching 20,000, larger than London at the same moment in history. Its central mound, known today as Monk's Mound, covered 14 acres at its base and rose 100 feet above a 50-acre civic plaza. By volume of earth moved, it exceeded the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Surrounding it, 120 additional mounds arranged in deliberate spatial relationship to one another and to the cardinal directions. European and American observers had noted and mapped the site since the 18th century. The scale was never obscure. The attribution was always the problem. Thomas's 1894 report did not end the myth in popular culture. It did not even slow it significantly. His correction was absorbed into academic archaeology, where it became consensus within a generation. Outside those walls, the lost race theory continued appearing in newspapers, popular histories, and school curricula well into the 20th century. The myth was useful. The truth was inconvenient. And so the myth persisted, not through ignorance, but through preference. This was not confusion. This was a choice, made repeatedly, by people who knew better. What I keep returning to is not the myth itself, but what it required everyone to overlook. Not just Cahokia, though Cahokia alone should have ended the debate, but the centuries of organised construction, trade and engineering that made Cahokia possible. Cahokia didn't arrive fully formed from the landscape. It was the culmination of a tradition stretching back at least 1,500 years before its peak, built through successive cultures across the eastern half of the continent, each one extending what the last had established. The oldest layer of that tradition is the Adena culture, centered in the Ohio Valley. By approximately 500 BCE, Adena peoples were constructing conical burial mounds over prepared interment pits, rarely more than 30 feet tall, but encoding something significant, a shared set of funerary practices that required coordinated labour. Grave goods in Adena burials, worked copper, carved stone tablets, tubular pipes, indicate craft specialisation and an exchange network extending well beyond any single settlement. The organisational pattern Adena established was not erased by the cultures that followed. It was inherited and elaborated across centuries into what came next. The Hopewell tradition emerged in the Ohio Valley around 100 BCE and spread across the Midwest and Southeast over 6 centuries. Hopewell was not a single political entity. It was a shared ceremonial and exchange system, binding communities across distances that would have required weeks of travel. The evidence of the Hopewell system is still in the ground, and it is harder to dismiss than any argument about it. Newark Earthworks in Licking County, Ohio, enclosed 4 square miles of carefully aligned geometric earthworks, circles, octagons, and parallel walls whose orientations track the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, with a precision that took archaeologists decades to recognise. The Great Hopewell Road, a pair of parallel earthen walls 60 feet apart, extended for at least 60 miles across the Ohio landscape, connecting Newark to the mound complexes at Chillicothe. Hopewell burial mounds, and there were thousands of them, distributed from Illinois to New York to the Gulf Coast, contained objects that had travelled distances no ordinary exchange could explain. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region, copper from the shores of Lake Superior, shark teeth and conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the southern Appalachians, silver from Ontario. These were not trade goods. They were ceremonial materials, carefully worked into specific forms, copper headdresses, mica cutouts, effigy pipes carved from stone quarried hundreds of miles away, that appear in elite burials across 1,000 miles of continent. What held this system together was a shared cosmological framework so compelling that communities from Wisconsin to Florida participated in its maintenance for 6 centuries. That framework left something behind that the mythmakers of the 19th century couldn't have anticipated. In the early 2020s, a research team analysing skeletal remains from Hopewell burial mounds in Ross County, Ohio, primarily from the Mound City Group, one of the most extensively documented sites in the country, recovered ancient DNA and subjected it to genomic analysis. The findings confirmed what the archaeological record had indicated for over a century. The individuals buried in these mounds carried Native American ancestry, consistent with populations continuously present in the Americas for thousands of years before European contact. The analysis also documented biological diversity within the Hopewell community, not a genetically isolated group, but a population connected through movement, intermarriage, and sustained exchange across significant distances. Then there was one finding I keep returning to: a rare mitochondrial DNA variant, identified in a small number of individuals from elite Hopewell burial contexts in Ohio, appeared again in skeletal remains recovered from high-status burials at Cahokia, 5 centuries later, 400 miles to the west, a genetic thread running from the Hopewell dead to the Cahokia living. The official explanation for the mounds had always been indigenous construction. The genome confirmed it from a direction no 19th century mythmaker had been equipped to anticipate. The archive doesn't forget, not even when everyone agrees to. Consider for a moment what it meant to live inside Cahokia at its height. At the city's peak around 1050 CE, Monk's Mound rose 100 feet above the Grand Plaza, a carefully levelled open space covering 50 acres at the city's ceremonial centre. The plaza was not incidental, levelling 50 acres of floodplain to a precise grade, maintaining it as open space in a densely populated city, orienting it to the cardinal directions. These were deliberate acts of urban planning sustained over generations. To the west of Monk's Mound, a series of large red cedar posts formed a woodhenge, an astronomical instrument that tracked solstices and equinoxes and encoded the ceremonial calendar in wood and shadow. The palisade wall, 2 miles of sharpened cedar logs set into a prepared trench, reinforced with bastions, rebuilt at least 4 times, enclosed the central precinct. The people who lived within that wall left material traces of what their world required. Craft specialists worked copper into ornaments and ritual objects. Ceramic artists whose distinctive styles have been identified at sites hundreds of miles away. Farmers who fed a city of 20,000 from the surrounding floodplain. And in the elite burials, those recovered from the mounds at the city's centre, the reach of Cahokia's world is documented object by object. Conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from Lake Superior, chunky stones ground to exacting tolerances for a game played from Minnesota to Louisiana. Each object is a record of distance travelled, relationship maintained, authority acknowledged. There was a woman, there must have been thousands of them, who grew up inside that wall in the 1080s CE. She would have known the woodhenge as a fixed feature of the sky, watched the cedar posts cast their shadows across the Grand Plaza at solstice, carried water from the river past the base of Monk's Mound. She would have understood the city the way people always understand the place they were born, as something permanent, as something that had always been there and would continue to be. Her grandchildren were born into its decline, the palisade walls in disrepair, the plaza quieter. Their grandchildren were born into a different world entirely. That disappearance, the slow contraction of Cahokia across the 13th century, the dispersal of its population into smaller communities across the region, is not a mystery. Cities contract, environmental pressures accumulate, populations relocate. What followed Cahokia's decline was not erasure but transformation. The same Mississippian ceremonial traditions, the same cosmological framework, carried outward into the nations that European explorers would encounter in the 16th and 17th centuries. Those nations knew who had built the mounds. The myth required pretending they didn't. By the time Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis finished their Ohio survey in 1847, they had visited sites that Native American nations still regarded as sacred. The Mound City group in Ross County, which would later yield the DNA evidence that confirmed indigenous ancestry, was surveyed, mapped, and published without meaningful consultation with the nations whose traditions connected them to those places. The Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, and the Wyandot had been removed from Ohio in the 1840s, removed in some cases within years of the survey's completion. Squire and Davis were not working in ignorance of indigenous presence. They were working in its aftermath, and they chose to theorize. A vanished race rather than acknowledge a living one. There are moments in the historical record where the shape of a choice is visible. In 1843, John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood published their documentation of Maya ruins in Central America. Massive, unmistakable, clearly the product of a sophisticated civilization, and correctly attributed them to the ancestors of the Maya still living in the region. The attribution was not controversial. The same logic applied to the Ohio earthworks 4 years later was rejected. The difference was not evidentiary, it was political. The nations displaced from the mound landscapes had oral traditions that connected them to those places. The Miami, the Shawnee, and the Potawatomi carried knowledge of the mound's significance, knowledge that was not sought, not recorded, and not credited in the publications that shaped American understanding of the earthworks for the next century. The correction Cyrus Thomas published in 1894 drew on the archaeological and material record, not on indigenous testimony, because by 1894 the discipline had spent decades building a wall between itself and that testimony. This is the silence that matters most. The denial wasn't ignorance, it was infrastructure. There is a specific form of violence in the method. These surveys were conducted in the direct wake of forced removal. Squire and Davis began their Ohio fieldwork in 1845. The Wyandot had signed their removal treaty in 1842. The Delaware had been removed across the 1820s and 1830s. The Shawnee followed shortly after. The mound landscapes were documented and published as mysteries in the absence of the people whose traditions already held the answers. The timeline of how that infrastructure operated is worth stating plainly. 1820. Caleb Atwater hypothesizes a vanished race. 1832. Josiah Priest sells 22,000 copies of a book arguing the builders were ancient Israelites. 1848. Squire and Davis publish with the Smithsonian's authority behind them. 1830 to 1850. The federal government removes the nations whose ancestral landscapes are being surveyed. 1894. Cyrus Thomas publishes his correction. It enters archaeological consensus. It does not enter the popular imagination. 1910. A golf course is built across a significant portion of Newark Earthworks in Licking County, Ohio. It is still there. 1967. The Mound City Group is incorporated into the Mound City Group National Monument, later expanded into Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. Early 2020s. Ancient DNA recovered from those same mounds confirms Native American lineage, biological diversity, and a genomic thread connecting Hopewell to Cahokia. The correction is confirmed, again, from a direction no one in 1848 could have anticipated. What I keep coming back to is this. The DNA study did not answer a new question. It answered a question that Cyrus Thomas had answered in 1894, using different instruments. What the genomic evidence added was a form of proof that carries no memory of the 19th century political contest, no archive that could be suppressed, no testimony that could be dismissed, no institution that could be defunded. The people buried in the Hopewell mounds were Native American. They were biologically connected to the people who built Cahokia. The network of exchange, ceremony, and engineering that produced Newark, Mound City, and the Grand Plaza at Cahokia was a continuous human achievement across more than 1,000 years of North American history. The genome says so, the architecture says so, the oral tradition said so before anyone thought to ask. The mounds are still there. Monk's Mound is a state historic site in Collinsville, Illinois, open to the public. You can walk up it, stand at the summit, and look out across the same floodplain a city of 20,000 once occupied. Hopewell Culture National Historical Park encompasses 5 mound complexes in Ross County, Ohio. The DNA studies are published in peer-reviewed journals. The architectural evidence is measurable, documented, and accumulating. What the 19th century buried was not the mounds. Those proved indestructible. What was buried was the willingness to read them correctly, and the people whose oral traditions already had. In the storerooms of the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park and the Ohio History Center, there are objects recovered from Hopewell burial mounds across Ross County, effigy pipes, mica cutouts, copper headdresses, and among them, pieces of raw copper from Lake Superior. Copper carried more than 500 miles south and placed in the earth around 200 CE. The copper is still there. The distance it traveled is still measurable. The people who carried it were Native American, and their descendants know it, and the genome confirms it, and the mound that held it stood for 18 centuries before anyone with institutional authority chose to read what it said. The mounds were never primitive, they were never a mystery, they were a library. And for 200 years the people with the keys decided not to open it.